Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. When my husband was deployed, I thought I'd already been through so much. The distance, the nights without him beside me, the loneliness I tried to hide from my son. But nothing prepared me for the changes in my boy. At first, it was subtle, quiet moments, him being distant, staring off into space for longer than usual. It wasn't the typical missing dad kind of sadness, though. No, it was something darker, something that filled the air when he was around. I kept asking him what was wrong, but he'd just shrug. I didn't want to push too hard, figuring maybe he just needed time to adjust. But over the next few weeks, the behavior became more unsettling. I remember one afternoon when he was supposed to be playing outside, and I found him sitting on the porch steps, looking at the sky. There was no joy in it, just a blank stare. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "Nothing," he answered, but the way he said it felt like a lie. I tried to brush it off. Kids go through phases, don't they? They're affected by more than we realize. But as time went on, I began to wonder if it was something deeper, something that I might not be able to fix. I didn't want to be dramatic, but the unease gnawed at me. I wasn't just missing my husband anymore. I was afraid of my son. Weeks passed, and things only seemed to get worse. His behavior shifted slowly, in ways that didn't scream for attention, but rather lurked beneath the surface. He'd stop talking halfway through sentences, as if he had forgotten what he was saying, and then stare off as if he was seeing something I couldn't. He started talking less, and when he did, his words were so different from the energetic child I once knew. He didn't laugh like he used to. His smile felt hollow. His eyes, they were distant, calculating, as though they weren't filled with innocence anymore. One day, after school, I found him sitting in the living room, drawing. But these weren't the happy pictures of family or nature. These were dark, fragmented shapes, images that seemed jumbled and disconnected. I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to ask him about the pictures. "Who are they?" I said gently. "They're just people," he replied, his voice flat. He didn't seem eager to explain. It was as if he didn't care that I wanted to know. The quietness in our house, once just a part of my new reality, now felt oppressive. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was happening to him, something I didn't understand, something that was slowly creeping in. I remember thinking to myself, if this is just a phase, then I'm scared of what comes next. But I didn't have the courage to ask myself what that even meant. I reached out to his teacher the next week. She told me he wasn't engaging with the other children. She said he just stood at the edge of the group, watching, never joining in. I was worried. Is this a sign of something deeper? When I asked if he was getting along with his classmates, she hesitated. "Well, it's hard to tell. He doesn't really interact with anyone," she said softly. My heart sank. My son, once the life of any gathering, had turned into someone I didn't recognize. That evening, I tried to have a conversation with him about it. "You know, honey, it's important to be around other kids, to make friends and talk to them," I said, sitting beside him on the couch. But when I looked at him, I couldn't help but feel a chill. His face was calm, too calm. "I don't need friends," he said simply, as if that was the end of the conversation. I pressed on, "But don't you miss having fun with other kids, playing games?" He gave a slow shake of his head. "I'm fine," he said, but I could feel something wasn't right. His words were too calm, too detached. It was as if he was speaking to me from a distance, a place that didn't involve me. I was talking to my son, but I wasn't sure if I was truly reaching him anymore. The days seemed to blur together as I tried to keep everything normal. But normal was slipping away from me. My son, once full of life and laughter, had become a stranger. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't find the cause. I remember one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I heard his voice, soft, almost a whisper. I rushed into the living room, but there he was, sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. His lips were moving, but the words were too faint for me to hear clearly. I called his name, but he didn't respond. I took a step closer and realized he wasn't talking to anyone in the room. He was just talking to himself. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, frozen. I asked him again, this time more firmly, "Who were you talking to?" He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with me in a way that sent chills down my spine. There was no warmth in his gaze, no recognition of the mother who had cared for him since birth. "My friend," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Your friend?" I repeated, feeling my pulse quicken. "Who is your friend, sweetheart?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me with that same eerie look, like he was studying me, sizing me up. "You wouldn't understand," he finally muttered before turning his attention back to the wall. It was then that I realized this wasn't just the sadness of a child missing their father. No, this was something else. Something that I couldn't explain. Something that scared me more than anything else in my life. I wanted to ask more questions, but the words wouldn't come. How could I ask about a friend that wasn't there? How could I make sense of this? The following day, I spent hours searching his room, looking for any clues that might explain his strange behavior. What was going on with him? What had changed? I needed answers. I found a small notebook tucked beneath his bed, the pages filled with crude drawings, sprawling, jagged lines and strange symbols that I didn't recognize. Some of the pages had words scribbled hastily in the margins, but they didn't make sense. "They can't know." One page read. "I won't let them stop me," another said. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, feeling a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. These were not the childish scribbles of a curious young boy. No, these were dark, deliberate markings. The kind of things that belonged in a mind far older than his years. I called his name softly, hoping he hadn't noticed me going through his things. He walked into the room, saw me holding the notebook, and for the first time in a long while, his expression shifted. It wasn't anger, but something colder, something more unsettling. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, flat. I didn't know how to respond. The questions in my mind were too many, too overwhelming. I found this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What is it? Why are you drawing these things?" He looked at the notebook for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating something, weighing his options. Then he shrugged, an almost casual movement that made my heart race. "It's nothing. Just practice." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. My son was slipping away from me, and I had no idea how to stop it. I wanted to hold him, to protect him, but the distance between us felt so wide, so impossible to bridge. I didn't know if I was still his mother, or if I was just another stranger to him now. I couldn't ignore the growing tension in the house. I tried to keep everything normal, to stick to our routines, but it was like living in a house built on shifting sand. One moment, everything would feel fine, and the next, the floor would crumble beneath me. It was worse when we were alone. The silence, the stillness, it was suffocating. And in that silence, I started to hear things. Faint whispers, footsteps when no one was around. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. I'd ask him what he was doing, but he'd just look at me with that same cold, distant expression. "I'm waiting," he'd say, as though that explanation made any sense. Waiting for what? Waiting for whom? I didn't know, but the more I tried to find answers, the more I felt like I was losing him. One night, after I heard him talking in his sleep again, his words jumbled and frantic, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to talk to someone. I called his father, hoping that hearing his voice would calm him, that maybe the connection would bring him back. But when I put the phone to his ear, he didn't speak. He just held the phone, staring at it like it was an alien object, before dropping it on the floor. "I don't want to talk to him," he said, his voice cold, his tone final. "He's not here." That was the moment I realized it wasn't just about missing his father. Something had changed inside him, something I couldn't fix. I needed help, but I didn't know where to turn. I felt utterly helpless. The boy I had known, my sweet, kind son, was slipping away, and I didn't know if I could save him. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear his voice echoing in my mind. "I'm waiting." Waiting for what? I tossed and turned in bed, haunted by that phrase, until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront him. When I entered his room, I saw him sitting by his window, just as he had the night before. His eyes were vacant, staring into the darkness as if searching for something. I approached cautiously, afraid of disturbing whatever strange world he had created for himself. "Who are you waiting for?" I asked softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't turn to face me. His voice was eerily calm when he answered, "The people who understand me." I felt a chill run through my veins. "Who are these people, sweetheart?" I asked, desperate for clarity. He looked up at me then, finally meeting my gaze. His expression was so blank, so detached, that it made my heart race. "They're not here yet," he whispered, "but they will be soon." I didn't know what to say to that. Who was he waiting for? I asked myself the question over and over, but the answer seemed too terrifying to consider. The more I asked, the further away my son seemed. The connection I had with him, that invisible thread that once bound us together, was fraying, and I didn't know how to stop it from unraveling. The next day, I reached out to a therapist. I had to. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I needed help, and I needed it now. The therapist seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. We talked for hours, and she listened carefully to everything I said. When I explained how my son's behavior had changed, she nodded, taking notes. "It's clear that he's experiencing some sort of emotional detachment," she said, her voice calm but serious. "This can happen in response to a major change in his life, like his father's deployment, but I think we need to dig deeper. There's more going on here." I could feel the weight of her words settle over me like a dark cloud. More going on? What could be worse than the cold, detached boy I was living with now? "Do you think he's dangerous?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The therapist hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It's hard to say, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned. Emotional detachment can lead to problems with empathy and trust." My heart sank. This wasn't just a phase. It was something deeper, something I wasn't prepared for. But I had to stay strong, for him, for both of us. We scheduled an appointment for him to see the therapist, but deep down, I didn't think it would help. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few sessions. Whatever was happening to my son went beyond what any therapist could see. When I told my son about the therapy appointment, he didn't even blink. He didn't protest or argue, not like I expected. He simply said, "I don't need help." His voice was so matter-of-fact, as though he had already decided that nothing could change him. "I'm not broken," he added. There was something chilling in the way he said it. Not broken. It was as if he was telling me that whatever was happening to him, whatever he was becoming, was intentional. That scared me more than anything else. The day of his appointment came, and he walked into the therapist's office without a word. I sat in the waiting room, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. Was I doing the right thing? Was this going to help him? When the session was over, the therapist called me into her office. "How did it go?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the nerves were eating away at me. "He didn't open up," the therapist said, "but I didn't expect him to. He's guarded, extremely guarded." I nodded, not sure if I should feel relieved or more frightened. "What do you think is going on with him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's shutting you out," she said, looking me directly in the eyes. "He's retreating into himself. And you're right to be concerned. This isn't just a typical reaction to his father's absence. There's something deeper happening here." I didn't know how to respond to that. Something deeper. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I was losing him, and I had no idea how to get him back. That night, I sat in the living room with my son, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we were facing. He sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the television, but I knew his mind wasn't on the show. I had to try again, try to break through the wall that was growing between us. "Do you miss your dad?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. He didn't respond right away. I couldn't read his expression. It was like looking at a blank canvas, waiting for some sign of emotion, some flicker of recognition. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "He doesn't matter." I blinked, trying to process what he had just said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He's not here, and he won't be." "I don't need him," he replied, his voice so cold it sent a shiver through me. The words hit me harder than I expected. "But he's your father," I said, my throat tightening. "He loves you." He turned to me, his eyes locking with mine, and for the first time in months, I saw something. something raw, something terrifying in his gaze. "Love doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice almost hollow. "It's just a word. I don't need it." My heart shattered at that moment. What had happened to him? My son, the boy I had raised with love and care, was slipping further away, and I had no idea how to stop it. The days following that conversation were a blur of silence and tension. I tried so hard to keep things normal, but every attempt felt like I was pushing against a wall. My son, once the center of my world, was becoming a stranger, someone I couldn't reach, couldn't understand. He withdrew further and further, retreating into his own world. The house felt empty, even when we were both there. I spent my days trying to hold on to some semblance of control, trying to keep up the facade of a happy home. But each night, I would lie awake in bed, terrified of what he was becoming. What was going on inside his mind? What had happened to my sweet boy? I couldn't help but think back to the day his father left for deployment. It had been so hard for him, so painful. But this was different. This wasn't just sadness. This was something else, something deeper. I began to wonder if the distance between them, the lack of his father's presence, was pulling him into something dark. But that didn't explain the drawings, the cryptic words, the strange way he spoke. I was in over my head, and I didn't know where to turn next. I tried talking to him again, but this time, I was more direct. "What's going on with you?" I asked, my voice trembling, but I had to know. "You're scaring me." He didn't look up from the book he was reading. He never looked up anymore. "I'm fine," he muttered, his tone flat, emotionless. "You're not fine," I replied, my heart pounding. "You're different, and it's scaring me. Why won't you talk to me? Why are you shutting me out?" He finally glanced up, and I saw that eerie look in his eyes again, the one that made my blood run cold. "Because I don't need you," he said simply. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, not knowing how to respond. My son, the child I had loved with every fiber of my being, was telling me he didn't need me. "I don't need anyone," he added, his voice so calm, so distant. "I'm fine on my own." I wanted to argue, to tell him how wrong he was, but I didn't have the strength. What could I say that would make a difference? He didn't want me. He didn't need me, and that terrified me. That night, after he went to bed, I sat in the kitchen, the light dim, my mind racing. I thought about everything, his behavior, the strange things he said, the drawings in his room. I had tried to get answers from him, but each time, he deflected, shutting me out more and more. Was this just a phase? Was this the result of his father being gone for so long? Or was it something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was taking root inside him. I thought about all the stories I'd heard, the cases of children who were once normal but had snapped, their behavior turning twisted and violent. I was no longer sure where the line between normal childhood development and something far more sinister lay. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't let him go down this path, whatever path it was. He was my son, and I couldn't lose him, not to this darkness that seemed to be swallowing him whole. The guilt and fear wrapped around me like chains, and I felt helpless. But I couldn't give up on him. No matter how lost he seemed, I had to find a way to bring him back. I started looking for other ways to help him, hoping to find something, anything that could fix this. I made appointments with different specialists, hoping someone would have an answer. I even reached out to a friend who had been through a similar situation with her son, who had gone through a rough patch after his father was deployed. Her son had come out of it, she said. He had needed therapy, time, and patience. Maybe that was what my son needed too. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just about therapy. This wasn't a normal reaction to his father's absence. This was something deeper, more ingrained. And I didn't know if I could fix it. I tried everything, counseling, books, even talking to a family friend who was a psychologist. Nothing seemed to make a difference. He was getting worse. He became more withdrawn, more distant, and I felt more and more like a stranger in my own home. He would barely speak to me, and when he did, it was always to brush me off or push me away. It was like he was building a wall around himself, a wall I couldn't break through. And every day, I felt more isolated, more alone in my fight to save him. It was one rainy afternoon when things took an unexpected turn. I was sitting in the living room, trying to read, but my mind kept wandering back to my son. I hadn't heard him for a while, which was unusual. When I went to check on him, I found him in his room, staring at the wall again, just like he had done before. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and I could see the faintest twitch in his hand. He didn't seem to notice me at first, lost in whatever dark world he had created. But then, as if he sensed my presence, he turned to look at me. There was something different in his gaze this time, something almost triumphant. "You don't understand," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm starting to understand everything." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew it wasn't good. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and turned back to the wall. "It's too late to fix anything now. I've already figured it out." I stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Was this the moment? Was he finally going to tell me what had been going on inside his head? Or had I lost him completely? The days blurred into one another, and I felt myself spiraling. My son had become more distant, more cold, and it was starting to take its toll on me. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything would be okay. He refused to leave his room, rarely came to the dinner table, and when I did manage to speak with him, it was like talking to a wall. I had tried everything: therapy, reaching out to family, even letting him have space, but nothing seemed to work. I was desperate, and the weight of the situation was wearing me down. I tried to remain calm, to be strong for him, but the fear that he was slipping further and further away from me was overwhelming. I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him to something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. Was it something about his father's absence? Or was it something deeper? I began to wonder if I was the one who was broken, unable to reach my own child. Every day, the silence grew more oppressive, and I could feel myself drowning in it. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring at the phone in my hand. I was debating whether or not to call his father. Maybe hearing from him would help. Maybe it would bring some kind of stability, something to break through the wall that had built itself between us. I thought about how much I wanted to hear my husband's voice, how much I needed him to reassure me that everything would be okay. But the longer I stared at the phone, the more I hesitated. What would I even say? How do I tell him what's happening to our son? The truth was, I didn't know how to explain it. It felt like too much, too complicated, and I didn't want to burden him with it. He was in the middle of a war, and the last thing I wanted was for him to worry about us. But what if he could help? What if he could say something that would bring our son back? I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going like this. I needed something, anything, to give me hope. I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my chest. It rang twice, then 3 times, before his voice came through on the other end. "Hey, babe." I could hear the distance in his voice, the faint echo of the world he was living in. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my emotions in check. It's about our son," I said, my voice breaking. "He's not the same. He's changed, and I don't know what to do anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustling of papers, the distant sounds of other voices. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone more serious now. "He's distant. He won't talk to me. He says things that don't make sense. He's acting like he doesn't care about anything. And I don't know how to help him." His silence stretched out for a moment, and I could feel the tears welling in my eyes. "I'm scared," I whispered. "I'm scared too," he replied, his voice low. "But we're going to get through this. We'll figure it out. We have to." I didn't believe him. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't. How could I trust that everything would be okay when everything felt so wrong? I could hear the pain in his voice, the same fear that I was feeling, but it wasn't enough to soothe me. What if we couldn't fix this? What if this was something beyond our control? My son's behavior had gone beyond anything I had prepared for. Every day was a battle, and I was losing. "I don't know if I can do this alone," I said, my voice breaking. "I need you here." I could hear the deep sigh on the other end of the line. "I know, babe. I know. I wish I could be there. but I'm doing everything I can to get home. It won't be long now. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe that once he came home, everything would fall into place. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind kept telling me that it wasn't going to be that simple. What if my son was already too far gone? What if the person he was becoming was someone I couldn't reach, no matter how hard I tried? I wanted to be strong, for him, for our family, but I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The weight of it all was becoming unbearable. I needed help. I needed answers. The next few days were filled with tension. My son's behavior continued to deteriorate, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells around him. Every conversation was strained, and every attempt to connect with him felt like a failure. It was like he was deliberately pulling away, pushing me further and further out of his life. I didn't know what had happened to him. I didn't understand what had changed. One night, I was sitting in the living room, reading through a stack of papers that had been piling up on the table. I was trying to focus, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept wandering back to him. Was he sleeping? Was he okay? I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. I got up and made my way to his room, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to see him. I had to make sure he was still there, still alive. I knocked softly on his door. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, slowly turning it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. He was sitting on his bed, his back to me, staring out the window. I could see his reflection in the glass, but his face was unreadable, distant. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond at first. Then, without turning around, he said, "You don't need to worry about me." I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His words cut deep, like a knife twisting in my chest. "You don't need to worry about me." It was so final, so dismissive. But how could I not worry? How could I not care? My son had become a shell of the boy he used to be, and every word he spoke seemed to distance himself from me even more. "I'm your mother," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "I will always worry about you. That's what mothers do." He didn't turn to look at me, didn't acknowledge my words. He just kept staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. He was slipping further away with every passing day. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his shoulder, a small attempt to bridge the gap between us, but he immediately shrugged it off. His body language screamed of rejection, and it hurt more than I could describe. I swallowed hard, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. I couldn't give up. I couldn't let him push me away. Not without a fight. "I don't care if you think I'm being overbearing," I continued, my voice soft but resolute. "I'll never stop trying to help you. You're my son, and I love you." He didn't say anything in response. He didn't even flinch when I spoke. It was as though he hadn't heard a word. His silence felt like a weight, crushing me slowly, suffocating me with each passing second. I stayed there for a long while, just watching him. I didn't know what else to do. How could I reach him when he wouldn't let me? How could I save him from whatever was taking hold of him if he wouldn't speak, if he wouldn't even acknowledge my presence? I finally left his room, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat on the couch in the living room, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't my son. I knew something had to be wrong, something deeper than I could understand. What had happened to him? What was going on inside his head? I had been looking for answers for so long, but every time I thought I was getting closer, I hit a dead end. I needed help. I needed someone who could see what I couldn't, someone who could help me understand what was happening to him. But who? I picked up the phone again, my hands trembling. I scrolled through the contacts, hesitating. Then, I called his father. He picked up on the first ring. "Hey," he said, his voice full of concern. "How's he doing?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything I had been holding in. "He won't talk to me," I said, my voice cracking. "He's shutting me out, and I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything's fine. Something's wrong, and I don't know what to do." I could hear the hesitation in his voice, even through the phone. "I wish I was there," he said, the pain in his voice almost unbearable. "I wish I could help, But you're right. Something's not right. What do I do? I asked, my voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make him listen. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he had hung up. Have you thought about getting a second opinion? He asked finally. Maybe seeing another doctor, someone who specializes in, well, I don't know, behavioral issues? You've tried everything you can, right? I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see me. Yes, but it's not working. Nothing is working. He's not the same. And I'm scared. My words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. He didn't respond right away, but I could hear the sound of his breathing on the other end of the line. I'll be home soon, he said softly. I promise. I can't wait for you to come home, I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. But what if it's too late? What if he's already gone? He didn't have an answer, and in that silence, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running wild with thoughts of my son. Was it too late? Was I too late? The questions haunted me, keeping me awake until the early hours of the morning. The house felt so quiet, so lonely. I kept thinking about the way my son had looked at me earlier, like I was just a nuisance in his life. I kept replaying his words in my mind. I don't need you. It was like a dagger to my heart every time I thought of it. How had he gotten here? What had I missed? I knew he had always been a bit distant, but this was something different. This was something much darker. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no idea what to do. I felt powerless, unable to help him, unable to fix what was so clearly broken inside of him. I finally drifted off to sleep, but it was a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of losing him completely. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of urgency. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. It was time to take the next step. I picked up the phone again and called the therapist who had been recommended to me. I didn't care how much it cost. I didn't care what it took. I had to do something. I couldn't lose him. The therapist's office was cold and sterile, and I couldn't help but feel out of place. The walls were a dull gray, and the sterile smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. As I sat in the waiting room, my mind raced. Was this the right decision? What if this was just another dead end, like all the others? I kept telling myself that I had to give this a chance, that I had to do everything I could to help my son, but doubt still gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was scared of what we might find, scared that this therapy wouldn't work, scared that I was losing my grip on my son. When they called my name, I stood up quickly, too quickly, and almost stumbled. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led me into her office. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, folding my hands tightly in my lap. "How can I help you?" she asked gently, looking at me with understanding. I hesitated. How could I explain all of this in words? How could I even begin to tell her what was happening to my son? I took a deep breath and started. "It's my son," I said, my voice trembling. "He's changed. He's distant, cold, and I don't know what's happening to him. It's like he's becoming someone else, someone I don't recognize. And I'm scared." She nodded, her expression serious but compassionate. "Tell me more," she said. As I spoke, I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I had to be strong. I couldn't break down now. I explained everything. The distance, the coldness, the way my son seemed to shut me out at every turn. I told her how I had tried everything I could think of, talking to him, giving him space, taking him to a therapist before, but nothing had worked. And then I told her about how his behavior had started to change after his father was deployed. She listened carefully, nodding along, but her expression didn't change. She didn't offer any immediate comfort or solutions, which, in a way, was both a relief and a frustration. I wanted answers. I needed them now. "It sounds like he's struggling with something deeper," she said after a long pause. "It's not uncommon for children to react this way when there's a disruption in their lives, especially when it comes to a parent being absent. His behavior might be his way of processing the fear and uncertainty surrounding his father's deployment. But there could be more to it than just that." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "I'm not a doctor. but it's possible that there's something else going on. I'd recommend a full evaluation. We need to rule out any psychological or emotional issues that might be affecting his behavior. The suggestion hit me like a ton of bricks. A full evaluation? I had no idea what that entailed, but the very idea made my stomach turn. What if they found something I didn't want to hear? What if they found something that I couldn't fix? The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear. But deep down, I knew she was right. I couldn't keep going on like this, pretending that everything would just magically get better. I had to face the truth, whatever it was. I nodded, though my mind was still reeling from the weight of her words. "Okay," I said, my voice small. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." "Good," she said softly. "It's important to take the next step, but I also recommend that you continue therapy. For yourself. This is a lot for you to handle alone, and you need support as well." I felt the sting of her words, but I knew she was right. I had been carrying the weight of all of this on my own for too long. I had been so focused on helping my son that I had neglected my own emotional well-being, and it was wearing me down. "I'll do that too," I said quietly, though I didn't feel as confident as I wanted to. The days that followed were a blur of appointments, evaluations, and more uncertainty. My son agreed to the evaluation, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. He resented me for pushing him, but I couldn't back down. I couldn't let him slip further away. We spent hours at the clinic, meeting with different doctors and specialists, and I watched my son grow more and more withdrawn with each passing day. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't tell if it was my fear or his, but it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, after the evaluation, we sat in the car, parked outside our house. My son didn't say a word. He hadn't said much the entire day. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, my heart aching. "I'm doing this because I care about you," I said softly. "I know you don't understand, but I need you to trust me." He didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his face expressionless. The silence between us felt like a chasm, one that was widening with each passing moment. I was losing him, and I didn't know how to stop it. The results of the evaluation came back a few days later, and my heart sank when I read the report. There were no clear signs of a mental illness, but there were indications that my son was struggling with severe emotional trauma. The doctors believed that his father's deployment, combined with his own emotional withdrawal, had created a perfect storm. He was internalizing everything, pushing it all down instead of processing it. And as much as I had tried to reach out, I hadn't been able to give him the space he needed to deal with it. The evaluation report also suggested that we needed to try family therapy, not just for him, but for us. We needed to rebuild our relationship, to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the past few months. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had to try. For him. For us. The days following the evaluation were heavy with the weight of the report. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, even if the doctors hadn't pinpointed anything specific. I'd been so focused on finding a diagnosis, but now I was starting to realize that the situation wasn't just about fixing him. It was about healing us. My son had always been my priority, but it had never occurred to me how much I had neglected myself, how much I'd neglected us as a family. The thought of family therapy was intimidating. The idea of sitting in a room with strangers, talking about our emotions, our brokenness, felt like too much to bear. But the doctors had said it was necessary. If we were going to move forward, we had to confront the past, confront the things we had ignored, and try to rebuild what we had lost. That night, I sat down with my son, the silence between us more deafening than ever. He was sitting on the couch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed on the TV, though he wasn't really watching. I took a deep breath before speaking. "We need to go to family therapy," I said quietly, trying to make my voice sound as calm as possible. He didn't look at me, didn't react. His silence was suffocating, but I pressed on. "I know you don't want to, but it's important. We need to work through everything that's happened. It's not just about you, it's about all of us." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might speak, but then he just shrugged. "I don't care," he muttered, his voice barely audible. His indifference was like a slap in the face. I had expected resistance, but this felt different. It was like he had completely shut himself off from me. It was as if he didn't even care anymore. The words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I fought to keep my composure, to not let my hurt show, but the tears were already threatening to spill. I stood up and walked over to him, sitting beside him on the couch, my heart in my throat. I care, I whispered. I care about you more than you'll ever know. And I'm doing this because I love you. He didn't say anything in response. He just stared ahead, his face unreadable. I couldn't tell if he was angry, sad, or numb. Maybe a little bit of all three. But he didn't pull away when I reached for his hand. I held it gently, waiting for him to make the next move. The days after that conversation felt like a constant tug of war. My son agreed to the therapy sessions, but I could tell it was more out of obligation than any desire to participate. I couldn't blame him, not really. How could he want to talk about his feelings when it felt like the whole world was against him? The first therapy session was awkward. My son barely spoke, and I found myself doing most of the talking. The therapist, a kind man in his early 40s, was patient, but I could tell he was struggling to get my son to open up. His silence spoke volumes. The therapist asked questions about his father's deployment, about how he was coping with his emotions, but my son just stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. "It's okay," the therapist said gently. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready. But we're here to help." My son's response was a simple shrug. He wasn't ready. I could feel the frustration building inside of me. Why wouldn't he just open up? Why was he making this so hard? But as I sat there, watching him, I realized that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about making him do something he wasn't ready for. It was about giving him the space to heal, to work through whatever pain he was carrying in his own time. The second session was just as difficult, but this time, there was a small shift. My son spoke, though it was only a few words. "I'm fine," he said flatly when the therapist asked how he was feeling. It wasn't much, but it was something. The therapist didn't push him, but he acknowledged it. "It's good to hear you say that," he said, nodding. "Even if it doesn't feel like much, it's a step forward." I was relieved to hear those words. I wanted to believe that we were making progress, that things would get better, but the doubts still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for him to truly open up, to share what was really going on in his mind. Would he ever get there? And if not, what would that mean for us? It felt like the weight of all my fears was hanging over me, like a dark cloud that I couldn't shake. As the session ended, my son stood up and walked out without saying a word. But this time, I didn't feel as defeated. I knew that healing wasn't a quick fix. It would take time, and as long as he was willing to take the first steps, that was all I could ask for. The weeks that followed were a mixture of small victories and setbacks. My son didn't speak much during the therapy sessions, but he was coming. He was participating, even if it was in the smallest ways. And that was enough for now. At home, there was still tension in the air. There were moments when it felt like everything was slipping back into the way it had been. But then there were moments of connection. Small, fragile moments that made me believe that things could get better. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, my son looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in days. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice tentative. It was a simple question, but it meant the world to me. I could see the effort he was making, the small steps he was taking to reconnect. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, we weren't too far gone. The progress, though slow, was becoming more noticeable. I could see the flickers of the son I used to know, his old sense of humor starting to peek through, his little gestures of kindness that used to come so naturally to him. At least, that's what I told myself. I tried to hold on to those moments, to believe they were signs of something changing. But there were still times when he pulled away, when the walls would go up again, and I'd feel like I was losing him all over again. But I wasn't giving up. I couldn't. Not now. The therapy had become a routine for us, and though he still resisted it, I could tell he was getting used to the idea. The therapist had suggested that we also incorporate some activities into our routine that would help us bond. Simple things like cooking together, going for walks, or playing a game. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I was willing to try anything. That afternoon, I decided to ask my son if he wanted to cook dinner with me. I was expecting him to refuse, to give me the same indifferent shrug he usually did, but instead, He looked up from his phone and nodded. "Sure," he said, his voice soft but not dismissive. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We spent the next hour in the kitchen together, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and exchanging quiet words. It wasn't the deep conversation I had hoped for, but it was something. There was a sense of normalcy in the air, a fleeting moment where it felt like we were just mother and son again. It was during those quiet moments that I could almost pretend things were the way they used to be, before everything changed. As we sat down to eat, I watched him closely. He didn't seem like the same person he had been just a few months ago. Distant, angry, impossible to talk to. There was still a long way to go, but I could see the small, tentative steps he was taking toward healing. Maybe he wasn't as lost as I thought. Maybe we weren't as lost as I thought. "This isn't bad," he said, taking a bite of his food. His tone wasn't filled with the usual sarcasm or indifference. It was just a simple statement, and it made my heart swell with relief. "Yeah," I agreed, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Maybe we should cook together more often." He looked up at me, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was something there, something that hadn't been there for a long time. A flicker of connection. It was a small moment, but it meant everything to me. The therapy sessions were still tough, but they had become more of a routine for my son. He had stopped outright refusing to attend, and though he rarely spoke in the sessions, I noticed that he was paying more attention. He was listening, even if he wasn't ready to share. And I couldn't ask for more than that. But there were still days when the silence between us felt suffocating, when I couldn't help but wonder if I was doing the right thing. Was I pushing him too hard? Was I expecting too much from him too soon? One afternoon, after a particularly silent session, we were driving home when my son broke the silence. "I don't like talking about it," he said, his voice low. "I just don't want to talk about it yet." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was nod, though my heart ached at his words. "That's okay," I said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. But I want you to know I'm here for you. Whenever you are ready, I'm here." He didn't respond right away, but I could tell he was thinking about it. And that was enough for me. We continued our routine, therapy, quiet evenings, small moments of connection. Slowly, it felt like we were starting to find a new rhythm, one that wasn't perfect but was more stable than it had been. My son began to engage more, even if it was just a little. He would occasionally ask about my day, or share something funny he saw online. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. But then, one evening, things took an unexpected turn. We were sitting at the kitchen table when he suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, almost to himself. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. What did he mean? "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine," he said, his voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "I hate this. I hate feeling like I'm not normal. Like I'm broken." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had thought we were getting somewhere, getting closer, even if it was only a little. But this was different. This was raw. This was real. I stood up and walked over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're not broken," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not. And we're going to get through this together. We just need to keep going. I'm not giving up on you." For a moment, I thought he might push me away, that he might retreat back into his silence. But instead, he dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. And in that moment, I knew he was still my son. He wasn't lost, not completely, and we weren't giving up on each other. It was one of the hardest moments I'd ever experienced. Seeing my son, the boy I once knew so well, broken down like that, it was more than I could bear. But as I stood there, holding him, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about him. It was about us, about the way we had both been changed by everything that had happened. His father's deployment, the distance that grew between us, the silence that filled the space where connection once lived. It had all taken its toll on both of us. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible through his tears. "I don't know what's happening to me." I held him tighter, wanting to take away his pain, even though I knew I couldn't. "You don't have to apologize," I said softly, my own voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone in this, okay? We'll figure it out together. One step at a time." He pulled away slightly, wiping his eyes, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know if I can get better." My heart shattered at the raw honesty in his words. I wanted so badly to promise him that everything would be okay, but I knew that healing wasn't that simple. "You don't have to know everything right now," I said gently, cupping his face in my hands. "You just have to take it one day at a time. And I'll be with you every step of the way." The days that followed were a blur of therapy sessions, quiet conversations, and small moments of connection. My son wasn't exactly talking more, but I could see that the walls around him were beginning to crack, little by little. There were moments when I would catch him looking at me, really looking at me, not just through me, and I would feel that familiar spark of warmth that had been missing for so long. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still days when he retreated into himself, when the anger and confusion would bubble to the surface again. But each time, we found a way to work through it. I kept reminding myself that progress wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and that was okay. We were both learning to navigate this new version of our relationship. That afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session where my son had barely spoken, I decided to do something different. I knew he wasn't ready to talk about the deep stuff, but maybe he would be open to something lighter. "So," I suggested, "why don't we go for a walk in the park? Just you and me. No therapy, no pressure." Surprisingly, he agreed. I could tell he wasn't enthusiastic about it, but he wasn't shutting me down either. As we walked through the park, the sun casting a soft glow over the trees, the air crisp and cool, something shifted. We didn't talk about anything important, but for the first time in weeks, we walked side by side, not in silence, but in quiet companionship. It was strange, but comforting. At one point, my son pointed to a group of kids playing basketball nearby. "I used to play with them," he said, his voice distant, almost wistful. "But I don't anymore. I just can't." His words were quiet, but they hit me hard. I wanted to ask him more, to push him to open up, but I knew better than to force it. "That's okay," I said softly, giving him the space he needed. "You don't have to be ready right now. We're just walking, just being here." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of his lips. For the first time in ages, he didn't look so lost. As the days went by, my son continued to show small signs of improvement. He still wasn't the same person he had been before his father left, but the cracks in the walls he'd built were becoming more and more visible. We were making progress, even if it felt painfully slow. The therapy sessions were starting to have an effect, though my son still rarely spoke in them. But I had learned to be patient. I was learning that sometimes silence wasn't a sign of rejection. It was a sign of vulnerability, a sign that he was processing things in his own way. It was difficult to accept at times, but I had to. He was still my son. Even if he wasn't the same, he was still him. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room, watching a movie. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt okay. There was no tension, no unsaid words hanging in the air. Just us, sharing the same space, without the weight of everything between us. As the movie ended, my son turned to me, his face unreadable. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice so quiet that I almost didn't hear it. My heart swelled at his words. "You don't have to worry about that," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm never going anywhere. We're in this together." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Things weren't perfect. There were still days when my son seemed distant, when the anger and frustration would rear their ugly heads. But those moments were becoming fewer and further between. I could see the change, even if it was small. We were learning to navigate the difficult parts of our relationship, and for once, I wasn't as afraid. I was no longer terrified of what the future held, because I knew that as long as we kept going, as long as we kept trying, we would get through it. There was still a long way to go, but I had hope. We both did. The journey felt never-ending, but it was becoming more bearable. I could see it in the way my son no longer looked at me with that blank stare. He had started to re-engage, slowly but surely. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but it felt like a weight had lifted, even if just a little. We had our good days, and we had our hard ones, but somehow, we kept moving forward. Therapy had become part of our routine. We didn't discuss the same things every time, but each session helped him process more of the complex feelings he had been bottling up. One afternoon, as we walked back from a session, my son finally spoke about something I had been waiting for, his father. "I hate it," he said quietly. "I hate how everything changed when Dad left. It feels like I'm not me anymore." It was the first time he had openly said anything about his feelings toward his father's deployment. I could tell it wasn't easy for him, but it was a step, a big step. "I get it," I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I feel the same way sometimes. But we're both still here, and we'll keep finding our way together." In the weeks that followed, it felt like we were finding a rhythm. I noticed more of my son's old self coming back. He started laughing at things he would have ignored before. There were moments when I could almost forget how much had changed, moments when it felt like things were slipping back into place. But I knew better than to believe it would be easy. Nothing was easy anymore. Yet, for the first time, I didn't feel the constant dread hanging over me. The tension that had been so thick between us was finally beginning to dissipate. My son even started to open up a bit more during our conversations. One night, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset, and he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. I think I'm starting to feel like myself again," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't know when it started, but I think I'm getting better." My heart swelled at his words. "You are," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And so am I. We're doing this together." The days became less about surviving and more about living. There were still moments when I caught myself worrying that the changes weren't permanent, that my son would slip back into that darker place. But each day that passed gave me more confidence that we were headed in the right direction. One afternoon, my son and I sat on the couch, watching a show together. It was an ordinary moment, but it meant everything to me. After the episode ended, he turned to me, a faint smile on his face. "Thanks for sticking with me," he said quietly. His words struck me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear him say that. I hadn't realized how much I needed him to acknowledge the struggle we had been through together. "Of course," I replied, my voice soft. "I'm always going to be here for you. You're my son. I love you, no matter what." We were learning to navigate life without the constant fear, without the unspoken tension. But it wasn't just about me and my son anymore. It was about the future. We were starting to make plans again, tiny ones at first, like cooking together on weekends or planning a day trip to the beach. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was enough. I was learning to trust that the good days weren't temporary, that my son's recovery wasn't just a fleeting thing. But even with that trust, there were still moments of doubt. I'd catch myself wondering if the real progress had yet to come, or if we had only scratched the surface. Still, I pushed those thoughts away. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to enjoy the small victories. "Do you want to go hiking this weekend?" I asked him one evening, looking over at him as he scrolled through his phone. "Just the two of us?" To my surprise, he looked up and nodded. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." The weekend arrived, and we headed out for the hike. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, the kind of day that made everything seem possible. It felt so ordinary, but in the best way. We didn't talk much on the trail, but it wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the comfortable kind of quiet that only comes when you feel safe with someone. The hike brought something unexpected, a sense of peace. I wasn't worried about what might happen in the future, or if my son would slip back into his darker state. All that mattered was that we were there, together, and we were okay. As we reached the top of the trail and sat down to rest, I looked over at him, feeling a quiet sense of pride. "I'm really proud of you," I said softly. He looked over at me, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time in months, he smiled. "Thanks, Mom. I'm proud of us, too." Back at home, the days were still quiet, but there was a comfort in the routine we had built. We were starting to live again, not just survive. The tension was gone. My son was still healing, still working through his emotions, but there was a lightness to him that I hadn't seen in so long. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, he looked at me with a seriousness I wasn't used to. "Mom, I know I've been hard to deal with, and I know I've put a lot of weight on you, but I'm not going to keep doing that. I want to get better. I want to be better." My heart swelled at his words. "You don't have to do this alone," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We're doing it together, every step of the way." We had come so far from the place where I had been afraid to leave him alone, where I was constantly on edge, worried about what was going to happen next. My son had changed, yes, but I had too. We were both stronger than we had been before, and though we still had our struggles, we were no longer facing them alone. That, in itself, was the greatest victory of all. The journey wasn't over, but it didn't need to be. We had each other, and that was enough.